If you want to be more effective in your work and in your life, and you'd like to have more confidence that you're meeting your intentions, this is where it begins. Welcome to Do Busy Right, helping you organize your information and manage your attention so that they work for you, not against you. We educate you and encourage you by discussing ways to be more effective, not more exhausted. Let's do busy right. Hi there. Today I want to talk about a workflow, a tool that's incredibly powerful for managing your tasks and reclaiming your valuable time. This is the concept of a backlog and, crucially, the refinement rhythm that keeps that backlog managed and manageable. My primary goal for today's episode is for you to understand this refinement step and to be able to do it if you want to do it. More broadly, I want to explain refinement to you in the hopes that you consider implementing and using a backlog. I genuinely believe that a backlog will help you flourish and it'll lower your stress around the tasks and commitments that you face. It's a tool that's designed to keep you from wasting time and attention on the things that don't matter. You see, a backlog is the most effective way to store your task list. And this is the things you know you need to take action on. It is truly the best tool the human race has developed for keeping and maintaining a list of actionable items, period. Well-structured teams of project people use a backlog to organize their own work. Now, this is called agile project management, and it has some other features, but the core is the backlog. And I want you to understand how to do it for your own personal productivity, your own personal task list, and your own personal application of attention and time. Now, the value here is undeniable. People who have implemented systems like this, and I will say Attention Compass is a system that fully leverages this backlog approach. People that have done it report saving 15 to 20% of their time every week. Imagine getting 6 to 8 hours back out of a nominal 40-hour work week. That's close to a full day every week. Now, I'm really confident that this will help you, and I'm really confident that once you get it into your hands, you'll be comfortable and frankly surprised at how little overhead it adds to your workflow on a daily basis. Now, one of the most immediate benefits of a backlog is that you don't have to create a to-do list every month. In fact, your to-do list is sitting there ready and waiting for you at any time. And that eliminates that rigmarole every morning of figuring out where yesterday's list is, what today has that you need to add to the list, or constantly checking your email through the day, which is surprisingly common for people to use as a task management system. When we do it that way, that daily ritual can easily consume 15 to 30 minutes, maybe more, every day. Now, let's say you just save 20 minutes a day, 5 days a week. And that's over an hour and a half of reclaimed time and attention right there. And I want to encourage you, it's not difficult to do. There's a few things you need to know, a few habits you need to build. It's about adopting a workflow and building a discipline, building habits. It's not about getting rid of old habits. We're just going to develop new ones so that the old ones naturally fall away. Now, the value of not wasting time and attention, as you well know, I believe it's profound. I believe our attention is actually the stuff that life's made of. I think that's why we exist as humans, to attend to things and then be able to apply our ingenuity to changing them. That's certainly what's expected of us at work. Now, when we look at these topics, I'm all about thriving. I'm all about mental peace, solid work, low stress, and integration of life and work into a seamless mosaic that we flow through in a calm, relaxed manner. And I want to use that to help people thrive. Now, I believe the most basic step in thriving is to demonstrate to yourself that you're in control and don't have to be frantic and stressed about the things that you need to do or where you're going to put your attention and time. Hustle culture is not thriving in my mind. And so I want to help you avoid that with all of the angst, all of the fear-driven, performance-driven ideas. Okay. Good systems should be calm and relaxed in use. Now, if you're interested in thriving the way I am, reach out. I'd be honored to help you try to figure it out. Take that next step towards your vision of thriving. Feel free to send me an email, larry@dobusywrite.com, or hit me up on LinkedIn. I'm not hard to find. So let's get into it. So first of all, let's talk about what is a backlog. It's hard to identify a backlog maybe just by looking at it. If you see a piece of paper with a list of one-liners on it, you can just about guarantee that that's not a backlog. But a good backlog is really just that. It's a list, but it's a list that's organized. And so when we talk about creating a backlog and using a backlog, most of what we're talking about is not setup, it's not organizing some tool. Most of what we're talking about is working in it. Okay. Just like working in, I don't know, a garden over time improves it. There's no heroic lift necessarily, but you go in and you do a little work here and there, and you prune a few things and you dig a few weeds and you just maintain rather than doing some, angst-ridden heavy lift. Okay. Now, what that means is that maintaining the backlog requires you to be active in it. And there are certain ways that that activity should be structured, certain things that you know to try to do as you're working with your backlog. That process, that touching and tending to it, to the list, to keep it useful, to keep it maintained so that the weeds aren't growing up through it. That process is called refinement. And we're going to talk a great deal about refinement in this episode. I'm going to explain to you how to do it, why it's important, give you examples of the kinds of things you should be thinking about while you're working in your backlog. So first of all, let's talk about when we think about a backlog is a list. The backlog is the collective term for all the items that are in the backlog. Just like a bunch of grapes is a collective term for the individual grapes. And grapes come in bunches so that you can effectively deal with them as a group. So a backlog itself is very much like that. It's made up of the items in there. Now, because the items make up the backlog, the characteristics of the items really determine the characteristics of the backlog. As an example, you can't have a backlog that's in priority order if your items don't carry and include some notion of priority. So as we're looking at this, we're going to talk about individual items and the kinds of properties a good backlog item should have. And in this way, it supports a good backlog. So it works together. Refinement is selecting items and improving them that generally improves your backlog as a whole. So I'll compare backlog items, good backlog items, to notes on a piece of paper somewhere, because that's the tactic that most people use. Okay. Most people's task and attention management is performed in one of two ways. It's either a yellow legal pad with scribbled notes about things that might be useful to do, A, or many people just skip even that step and use their email account to determine what they do on a daily basis. And both of these are very challenging ways to manage your list. There's fundamental flaws in both those kinds of systems that prevent you from managing your task list very well. And so we want to get away from those items and get over into a more sophisticated kind of tool. That's the backlog. So, characteristics of backlog items. Items on a backlog are clearer and more detailed than typical jotted task names. I mean, think about it. When you're doing your to-do list, you don't feel that you have time or space to jot down everything there is to know about this item. So you're counting on your brain to remember the detail. So in backlog, items are clearer and more detailed. In this sense, it's better to think of an item as more like an index card with a title and some description text rather than just some one-liner. Okay. Now, for this reason, SQL-oriented database systems and spreadsheet kinds of management tools don't tend to work as well, because there's this pressure each of us feels to kind of minimize the size of the line to fit into the tool. Okay. So an item in a backlog is more like an index card and has more richness to it. Okay. Now, this detail, where does this detail come from? Hey, Larry, when I think about going to get dinner, I don't necessarily want to have to, automatically choose the restaurant, go look at the menu online and decide what I'm going to have before I get there. I get that. Nobody wants to do that. And you don't have to. Okay. But this detail, this richness is added incrementally as a function of the refinement process. Now, one of the examples is the item's priority changes. Okay. There's a sense in which the priority of the item changes naturally. And there's a sense in which we recognize a step change in priority of an item and we go in and we change that intentionally and specifically. But detail in general is added incrementally, okay, as needed and as it's available. Now, in particular, and this is maybe the second most important idea about a backlog item. The first is that it contains some notion of priority. The second is an item should, over time, begin to define the desired outcome of the task, or at least included in the description. It's not best for an item to exclusively contain a list of steps. A list of steps won't hurt as long as the outcome is clearly specified. And this is important because when we go to do the task, what we're aimed at is some outcome, some result in the world. So if we can define that within the item, then we're much better off when we get ready to do that work. Another thing that's very helpful in an item, a card should contain some, if not all, of the information that we need to do the task. This is either it contains it directly as text on the card, or there's a link to resources that will tell you the information that you need. For example, if we have a task that is work on the marketing report, then it'd be great if that task description contained the item that we're going to need to use to improve the marketing report, i.e., the current version of the marketing report or a draft of last year's marketing report, or both. Now, as we're looking at this, we're really collecting the information as it occurs to us in a very real sense. So we never have to go on this drastic search. Well, not never. That's not fair. We normally don't have to go on this drastic search for information. There are times when the item jumps in priority to the point where it hasn't had sufficient time to marinate for us and collect up the information necessary to form a robust item. And that's fine. What we do then is what most people normally do, which is, hey, it's time to do the task. What is the task and what do I need to do to get it done, and thinking through all that stuff. So we're just getting a jump start on that by engaging in the refinement step. And then ideally, when the item gets to the top of the list, you grab it and you read it and you go, oh, I know exactly what to do. And you exactly go do it. Okay. How nice would that be, rather than having to stress out and have a lot of angst about, oh, hey, I don't know how to do this. Crucially, if your brain looks at an item and can't decide how to do it, there's a huge chance that you will procrastinate that task. Procrastination is in many ways a manifestation of your brain's uncertainty and fear response around making a decision on how to complete a task. Okay. The point of that is to say, typically, we'll either reduce or eliminate this need for frantically gathering information as we do work on a task under deadline, because it's already pre-gathered there, right? So this pre-collection of information reduces that need when we start to do a task. And that means that we're much more likely to actually get to work on the task rather than be distracted by having to define it. Now, a lot of the efficiency that you get from a backlog is not created efficiency. It's the backlog helps you avoid waste. And that's one category of waste, is the thrashing that we may have to go through in order to define a task well enough to get started. So we can pre-collect that information. It's very helpful. And that's what the refinement process is all about. Also in a backlog, there's some sense of priority ranking. Now, it can be a specific explicit ranking system, a color, high, medium, low, 1 to 10, or it can be the order of the items on the list. Okay. Now that's assuming that the list stays ordered, right? When you're not touching it, that it's not, it's self-destructing or something. But that's a pretty low bar to cover. So having that priority attached into the information on the card in some way really is just an aid to a sudden need to sort things, should that happen. Now, I'll take a minute and I'll talk about sorting, okay? The sorting task for human beings, if you stop and think about it, so think about one of the big examples I use is like alphabetizing papers that have been handed to me, test papers, because I work at a university from time to time and I grade test papers, and I'll hand out paper tests and people will take the paper tests and they'll hand them to me. Well, when I hand them back and when I'm recording grades, it sure would be nice if those were in alphabetic order. Okay. And that, when you try and do that, that is a surprisingly challenging task for the human brain. The default sorting algorithm, I'll get technical on you here. Okay. This is systems design, software systems design. The default ordering pattern that your brain uses is largely just a bubble sort, which means you take an item and compare it to other items. And then between comparison 1-to-1, you decide which item should come first in order. Okay. So you pick up the first paper from the stack and its last name that starts with M. Okay. And you put it down. And then you pick up the next item. And the first thought in your head is, well, this alphabetical letter doesn't come before or after M. Okay. And you put it physically relative to the other item. And then you walk through this. Well, the interesting part of that is you probably wind up having to compare each item to every item on the list or to some average percentage of every item on the list so that it sorts into the slot. So the more items you have, the longer this takes. Okay. So that's the default in your brain. Now recognize also that your brain has very limited working capacity. So you cannot store or alphabetize really a list of more than 3, 4, 5 items because you can't store them in your head. So we resort to physical things, but that algorithm has been demonstrated in algorithm theory to be an inefficient sorting mechanism. Okay. So when we keep things in priority order, then that avoids the need to do this expensive, expensive task of sorting and resorting. Okay. Now, think about that relative to generating a new list every day. Because you generate the new list, you cannot guarantee that it hit the paper in priority order. So you're going to have to go through and sort in priority order. Well, that means if you're writing down on paper, that means rewriting the items, which almost definitely means they'll be shorter than they ought to be. And it means comparing comparing each to every, which is an expensive mechanism. Okay, so having priority in hand and well dealt with is a time savings in and of itself. Okay, so items should have some priority ranking, even if that is the order of the items in a physical file or location. And one of the interesting things about priority, at least to me, is as it turns out, there is no absolute priority. Priority is always relative to other items on your list. There's no absolute measure. Now, deadlines are absolute. Well, they're at least binary. You either make them or you don't. And they're not typically movable. Okay. But deadline is not the same as priority. Deadline is different. So then when we think priority, it always is necessarily relative to the other things. Now we can take a stab at it in the early going. It's not bad to have a rule that says, well, every new item, hits at the middle, say, of the list. Okay. Maybe that'll work for you over time. Maybe not, but it's worth trying. Okay. So then we sort as things move along. Now, as we're looking at backlog items, there should be a priority ranking. It should be some relative mechanism to all the other items. Okay. And it should be pretty straightforward to change the priority of an item because that's one of the pieces of information we get over time from the world. It's easy to misunderstand the priority of an item when we first look at it. And so we might assign the priority incorrectly, or the external world, the priority might change. Many of us have had the experience where we're working away and the boss comes in and says, hey, you know that thing I asked you to do and told you it was due Friday? Well, I just got off the phone with the customer and they really need it today. So what's happened? Well, the deadline changed, which forced a change in priority and potentially a pretty dramatic change in priority as well. So priority needs to be straightforward to change. Okay, so that's some about good backlog items. And again, the backlog itself is like a bunch of grapes. Okay, a good cluster of grapes is made up of, you guessed it, good grapes. Okay, individually. And so in the same way, a good backlog is made up of good backlog items. And that's going to be a crucial idea as we get into refinement. All right. Now we look out then into, so we've talked about items and we've talked about the fact that the backlog is the collection of items that it contains. Okay, so let's talk now about properties of the backlog that are maybe results of good items or maybe something else about the backlog itself. So as a backlog, as a group of items, the backlog needs to be easily accessible and visible to you at a moment's notice. It should be simple for you to access and check. It should be at your fingertips. It shouldn't be in some esoteric SQL database that you have to do a bunch of syntax commands to get to. And it should be simple. It should be somewhere that's kind of top of mind for you so that it's easy to access and you go there to look for the next thing rather than consulting your 3 pounds of gray matter. Okay. Easily accessible. Now, in addition to being easily accessible, it's critical that the backlog be kept as a unit, that all the items on the backlog be located physically or in weird computer world, located in the same spot. Okay. That's because, if for no other reason, priority is relative. So if you have 10 items over here in priority order and you've got an 11th item over there outside the system, it's very difficult to manage the priority of that single item because it's not associated with the other items that really define its priority because priority is a relative thing. So all this has got to be in one place. Okay. Place, air quotes, place, right? Now, one important critical thing about that place is you cannot keep a reasonable backlog in your email. And it's partially about the fact that an email tool is not designed to support a backlog, but it's also equally important that the backlog needs to be private to you. And you don't need for other people to be able to put things directly into your backlog. Okay, because it's in order for you and they don't know where to put things in order. So they're going to throw it in there somewhere, okay, that's probably wrong. And then you're going to have to find the error and fix it. Okay, so you certainly cannot keep it in email. And by extension, you can't keep it in any place where information gets added outside of your control. Okay, so that leaves out things like Slack. So you need to isolate it, to insulate it from that information, that unfiltered information in the world. So all of this adds up to the pretty simple conclusion that you have to keep your backlog in its own dedicated place. Okay, now certainly that's a dedicated software tool. That's one possibility. But other possibilities are physical folders. Heck, you could do a pretty good backlog in a recipe box with index cards. You know what I mean? Index cards, 3x5 cards that are in order in a box that fits them very well. Okay. You could do a reasonable approximation of a backlog there. Okay. It has some things that are going to make it difficult in use, but you can do it. Okay. So the content of that backlog is sacred to you. You defend it. Okay. You don't allow people to add to it. Now, it's going to sound like I'm being mean or whatever, but I had a client who gave his wife, so a client gave a spouse access to the backlog. And things got put on there in her sense of priority and not in his. And it wound up to be this confusing jumble of stuff that he no longer trusted. Okay. So it's a big deal for you to get in there and move through it and to touch it. And as we said, to refine it so that you've got confidence that it reflects your situation and not somebody else's. Okay. So keep the content private, right? The backlog remains in rough priority order at all times. Okay. Now, priority is set by looking at backlog items in relation to other items. Okay. But when you add a new item, one of two things should be abundantly clear. Okay. When you add a new item, either the priority field is set to null, that is not filled in or not indicated on the card, or if the priority is indicated on a new item, that it then enter the list according to that priority order. Okay. So you don't want a system where all the priority 0 items, all the new items float to the top. Okay. So you want to have kind of a subspace where the new items collect up. And so you know that you need to touch them and improve them a little bit before they even get into the larger list, right? But that said, the backlog should remain in at least rough priority order. If you see something that's out of priority, you should reach out and fix it. The backlog as a collection should accept items it should accept items very easily. It should be trivial to get a new item in the direction of the backlog, say into the tool and on this sub list of things I haven't thought about yet. Okay. And you stick it in there, and then there's a process for a part of the workflow for dealing with that. But it should be simple. It should be, quick to get things in there. Otherwise, what'll happen? If it's not easy for you to do something, what do we typically do? If it's not easy, we procrastinate. Okay. And then it doesn't wind up getting done. So now, we want the backlog to be in priority order, so we want the tool to support priority order. And whether that's physical, like in the recipe box, or some other function in a computerized list, we want to make sure that that works out. And it's not really hard to do it. It's really not hard to do it. Particularly as you rank these things relative to each other. All right. Critically, a completed task has no priority. Okay, it's done. By definition, it cannot have a priority, because priority is about when to do it, how much attention to put on it, what is it relative to others. Well, completed is just, it's not 0 priority, it's not infinite priority, it's just null priority. It has no priority. So we've got to be able to indicate that as well as items come off the list. That's pretty simple in a recipe card box. You complete the stuff on the index card and you throw it away. Right. And that's important in terms of maintaining the order. Now we'll move on. What's refinement? So then refinement is the work that you do to structure and improve your backlog. Another term for it is grooming the backlog. And as we've said, the backlog is the collection of items. A good backlog is made up of good backlog items. And so then refinement is about actually acting on the individual items in the list. Now, it's not a specific isolated step. I'm not going to say, oh, it's 10:15, drop what you're doing and do your refinement, right? It's typically not that urgent. Instead, it's embedded into the workflows, okay? When you capture a new item, there's an opportunity to do a little bit of refining of that item. And a group of well-refined items results in a well-managed backlog. Now, refining an item, there's a few key actions. So I've already alluded, I think, to most of them, but we'll run them down just so you have a complete sense of what's going on. Part of it is to, when we refine a backlog or an item, part of it is maintaining and improving the item itself. And that means adding information to it, correcting false information that's in there for whatever reason, those kinds of things. And so we're working on the information. Now, in order to do this, an easy way to think about it is to, when you see an item, ask yourself some key questions about the item, okay? And I'll give you some examples. Do I know any more about this item than I did last time I looked at it? when I look at the item, does something occur to me and say, ooh, this item needs to include being blue? If so, go ahead and do it. Okay. Another question is, do I understand enough about the item to do it? Does it describe itself so that I have a reasonable chance of executing against it? Okay. If not, then maybe take a step to collect up a little bit more information about that item, depending on its priority. Another good question to ask is, have I learned something new about the item's priority? Okay, there's another concept called context. Have I learned something new about the context that would suit this item? I won't get into it, but you get the idea. Another good question to ask is there additional input I'm going to need that I need to go ahead and record in the card? Oh, if I'm going to do that, then I need to call Joe down the hall before. He'll give me some information about it that'll help me do it when I get started. So I need to call him first. Okay. Well, call Joe, get the information, put it on the call. Another great example is, has something changed in my understanding of the output of the item or the result that I'm seeking? And if so, we definitely want to record that. Okay. So the item should be easily editable. And this poses the primary challenge. The primary, but the primary among several challenges, which is editing an index card in a file is time consuming and error prone. And over time, you run out of space. And so, it needs to be easily edited. We're trying to record new information as we learn it. As we learn some new facts, okay, we should try to make sure we record it into the item rather than just storing that information in our skulls where we're likely to forget about it. Because your brain, while amazing, is not as reliable as you think it is. Most people think their brain is much more reliable than it actually turns out to be. And you'll have to trust me on this. Okay. So, again, one of the things we want to improve is the ranking of an item. Ooh, you know what? That's a little more important. Let me advance it a few cards in the list. And again, the process is not any sort of big, heavy lifting. It's about thinking briefly about the item, making small improvements on it as it goes by. So as we're doing this, when does it happen? Okay, it's not a single instance. And so when you say, when does it happen? That's kind of an odd question, but you get the idea. So it's a consistent process within the system. It should be your thought whenever you look at an item in your backlog for whatever reason let me just spend a second thinking about this. Have I learned something about this? If so, you jot it down. There's often some refinement that happens when we take an item from just out there near the list to moving it actually into the backlog. So we capture it and we throw it out there and it sticks. But then when we first want to bring it into the prioritized list, we add some information to it at that point. Okay, it's pretty seamless, right? Now, if we were using physical index cards, okay, it would be natural to collect up a few cards over here somewhere and then pick them up as a batch and walk over and then do the refining of those items as we put them in the file so that we can put them in priority. Okay, at least rough priority. So we want to be able to do the same thing that same idea, even if our tool is computer driven or something like that. Is, hey, let me throw this over there, right? Let me put it in the pile of undealt with, but identified things. And then when I get back to the list, I'll do a little refinement stuff. So the key is just to remember, every time you interact with a card, a good example is if you put a card between two other cards, can you take a second and look at one or both of those cards and just see, I found out about it, and just add that in. As higher priority items are completed and removed from the list, other items will kind of naturally move towards the front of the list. Okay. And then again, think about the recipe card box. If you do the front items, okay, then the back items kind of automatically move towards the front, right? Just through action and adding things to the list. Okay. So that's a big feature of a backlog that stays in priority order. Every time you put a card in, you're refining the global notion of priority across the list. Now, while an online tool can more or less automatically maintain sorted order, okay, a real refinement step and something that we need to consider as we're refining is to actively review items relative to potential for dramatic priority shifts. We want to be very careful to notice this and record it, okay? Because it doesn't just affect the single item, it affects all the other items in the list, okay? A way to think about this is, in some real sense, if an item is out of order, say by priority or whatever, then by definition, a big chunk of the other items are out of order as well. Okay. If a thing in your hand should be in position 3 on the list and you put it somewhere else, then the item that inhabits position 3 is in the wrong place. Right. And it seems like a small error, but these errors accumulate over time. Okay. So all this is a way to approach it and keep it straight. So that's a lot of information that's going on. Okay. And I've got show notes that explain some of these sorts of things, keep a list, like the list of questions, that kind of thing. So you can refer to that. And as I develop other resources to help you deal with the backlog, I'll make them available to you. So to recap, the backlog is essentially a collection of items that are continually being improved to get closer to the definition of a good backlog item. Okay. And as such, then the backlog generally improves as the collection of items have been improved. The backlog is a living, breathing list that stays in priority order in part because of the way you manage it and the way it works. Now, a lot of that happens automatically, as we've said, but the part that doesn't happen automatically is, where does a new item enter the list? And so we at least need to be careful about that. So we don't need to jump through a lot of hoops to get things in there. Okay. So we talked about that. It needs to be easy to get stuff moving in the direction of the tool. Good backlog items, fundamentally, a good backlog item is definitions and supporting material for tasks that you need to do. Attributes of the task itself, and then supporting material for completing the task. Okay. We've talked about some ideas. Clear task definition, a clearly defined outcome, notes on steps you need to take, a recorded real sense of priority in the ranking. It's not important what that ranking system looks like, but that it's applied evenly to all the cards and that it has some relative capacity to it. Okay. And then also a note for any relevant deadlines. So ultimately, the definition of a good backlog item is up to you. And it's about your need for information as you engage with work or a task in your world. Okay. So you can add information you want to. I don't know that I'd try to be minimalistic about this. And given a good tool, you shouldn't need to be. So it's about having a good backlog item is about ensuring that you've told yourself enough about the task, that you've recorded thoughts about the task. Ideally, when you look at the item, you should not have to refer to things in your brain. Okay. It's a little bit of a high bar, but you get it. Now, this is not really an automatic process. Parts of it are automatic, but the overall refinement of a backlog item is not automatic at all. Okay? It's not static. And that just reflects the notion that we learn about the world as we move through it. We gather information about these things, really, whether we want to or not. Okay, so getting it from the state of we recognize a new idea or a new thought about this task to getting it, reflecting it in the task is the only step we're worried about. Okay. A PhD research professor who taught us research methods had a phrase, and her phrase was handle your own rat. And what that meant was, there's only certain parts of an experiment that you can farm out, and you need to interact with the data as it's being created. Well, the same thing is true with your backlog items and your prioritized list. You need to interact with it while it's being created. Okay. That means that there's not a lot of automation required here. There's just not. And the more automation your tool supports, probably the worse backlog is going to result from it. Okay. You should be touching and feeling these things, these items, little improvements. Okay. A database type tool cannot do this for you, nor at present can AI, at least to the best of my ability to detect. And I'm trying to get AI to do this. So refinement's really simple. It's about taking the properties of an item and continually improving them. Okay. And I've talked about some candidate properties that you'll want to keep up with and improve. Right. But particularly the thing is its priority ranking relative to everything else. So that when you look at the list, it's clear what your next priority item is. You grab it, you look at it, and it says, call Joe and ask him about the thing. And you go, okay, his phone number is there. Boop, 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 boop. Hey, Joe, what about the thing? So there's not this hesitation as we start. So the ultimate purpose of this whole approach, implementing a backlog, embracing refinement, is to lower your stress and keep you from wasting your invaluable time and attention. It's quite simply the best tool the human race has invented for managing multiple tasks. Okay. And doing this well leads to flourishing. As a final metaphor, I'll say, you think about refinement in a backlog like this. If you set out to have a clean house or a cleaner house, you don't just dust the room. You can't dust the room. Okay. What do you have to do? You have to dust the individual items in the room. And once you've dusted all the items to the level of quality, dust freeness you care about, then you confidently say, okay, the room is dusted. Right. So similarly, with your tasks, you don't just manage your backlog, you refine the individual items within it. And through that consistent item by item improvement, you achieve a clear and manageable and highly effective task list that serves your goals, that saves you attention and thus time in the future. Again, that is a core aspect of flourishing in the modern world, and I offer it to you as a gift. If you're interested in flourishing, love to have you reach out. I'm not hard to find, and I'll leave it there for now. This is Larry Tribble, Ph.D. Thanks for taking some time to improve your task and information management on the Do Busy Right podcast. The show is dedicated to helping you think about how to get better at working. And we do this by improving your attention and your focus. I believe that your work is not just about your job, but about all the tasks that you do to turn yourself, your environment, and your relationships into what you want them to be. What we're really talking about here is the underpinnings of becoming who you want to be. The primary way I help people is through coaching the Attention Compass process. Attention Compass is 4 workflows and a tool set that support our information, task, and attention management. I help people with big goals to build habits that put them in a position to achieve. We do this by eliminating wasted time and wasted attention. If you'd like to know more, you can find me on LinkedIn or go to dobusyright.com for more information. Have a good week, more effective and less exhausted. Do Busy Right.